In the year 407 AD, the Roman legions marched out of Britain, their boots echoing one final time across the island's rugged terrain. For centuries, historians have painted this moment as a turning point, the beginning of a shadowy era we call the Dark Ages, a time when civilization supposedly crumbled, leaving Britain a desolate wasteland. But what if everything we've been told about this period is wrong? What if the departure of Rome didn't plunge Britain into chaos, but instead sparked a quiet resilience that shaped the nation we know today? The traditional story is dramatic and simple. Rome abandoned Britain, taking with it law, order, and culture. The history books claim that without Roman rule, the Britons fell into a barbaric stupor, their towns overgrown with weeds, their lives reduced to survival amid ruin. Yet archaeology tells a different tale, one not of collapse but of adaptation. Far from a cultural blackout, the 5th and 6th centuries reveal a society that didn't just endure, but evolved, defying the gloom of the so-called Dark Ages. Let's start with why Rome left. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was a giant on shaky legs, stretched thin by internal strife and external threats. Barbarian tribes hammered at its borders, while emperors grappled with corruption and rebellion at home. Britain, a distant province on the empire's edge, became too costly to defend. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius famously told the Britons to look to their own defenses. This wasn't a grand farewell, it was a pragmatic cut, a signal that Rome's priorities lay elsewhere. For the Britons, this could have been a death knell. Roman rule had brought roads, aqueducts, and bustling towns, symbols of a sophisticated world now slipping away. Instead of despair, though, the evidence suggests something remarkable. Life went on. Towns like York didn't vanish overnight. They transformed, their Roman foundations repurposed by a people unwilling to let go. Take the city of Wroxeter, once a thriving Roman hub called Viroconium. Conventional wisdom says it was abandoned, its baths and forums left to rot as the Dark Ages took hold. But excavations reveal a different reality. Timber halls built atop Roman ruins, signs of a community that didn't flee but stayed and rebuilt. This wasn't a ghost town, it was a living one, adapting to a new era. The idea of a total collapse comes partly from a lack of written records. After Rome's exit, the flow of Latin texts dried up, leaving historians with a blank page they filled with assumptions. Yet silence in the archives doesn't mean silence on the ground. Pottery, tools, and even the layout of settlements show continuity, not catastrophe. In East Yorkshire, for instance, archaeologists have uncovered sites where Roman-era farms transitioned smoothly into the 5th century. The people here didn't abandon their fields. They kept farming, trading, and living, just without Roman tax collectors hovering over them. This continuity challenges the label Dark Ages, a term coined centuries later by scholars who saw the post-Roman world as a cultural void. It's a catchy phrase, but it's misleading. Light didn't go out in Britain. It simply changed hue. Consider the hill forts like SouthCadbury in Somerset, which roared back to life after Rome's departure. These ancient strongholds, once eclipsed by Roman military might, were refortified in the 5th century, a sign of local leaders stepping into the power vacuum. Far from chaos, this suggests organization, a society rallying to protect itself. The Britons weren't helpless, they were resourceful, drawing on their pre-Roman roots to face an uncertain future. Religion, too, tells a story of resilience. The Romans had introduced Christianity, and its roots were deep by the time they left. Rather than fading, this faith grew stronger, blending with older British traditions. Monastic sites sprang up in places like the Witham Valley, their locations tied to ancient sacred landscapes. These weren't imported Roman ideas. They were homegrown, a fusion of new beliefs and old rituals. The practice of tossing weapons into rivers, a custom stretching back to the Bronze Age, lingered on, hinting at a spiritual continuity Rome couldn't erase. Economically, the picture shifts as well. Rome's departure cut Britain off from the empire's vast trade networks, or so the story goes. But evidence of Mediterranean pottery in post-Roman sites suggests otherwise. Trade didn't stop. It adapted. The Britons found new ways to connect, perhaps with Ireland or Northern Europe, keeping goods and ideas flowing. This wasn't a golden age of prosperity, but it wasn't a wasteland either. Rural life, the backbone of British society, held firm, with farmers adjusting to a world without Roman markets or coinage. Language offers another clue. The shift from British Celtic tongues to early forms of English didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, a sign of cultural exchange rather than conquest. Linguists now argue that native Britons adopted Germanic speech patterns over generations, influenced by small groups of newcomers rather than a sweeping invasion. This wasn't erasure, it was evolution. The myth of the Dark Ages thrives on images of marauding barbarians and abandoned cities, fueled by later writers like the Venerable Bede. Bede, writing in the 8th century, had his own agenda to glorify the rise of the Anglo-Saxon Church, casting the earlier period as a pagan mess needing salvation. But Bede's narrative overlooks the complexity of what came before. The Britons weren't waiting for rescue. They were forging their own path, one that didn't need a Roman blueprint. Archaeology backs this up with hard evidence. At places like Tintagel in Cornwall, a high-status site flourished in the 5th and 6th centuries, its occupants importing luxury goods from as far as Byzantium. This wasn't a backwater, it was a hub, tied into a wider world. The people here weren't cowering in the dark, they were thriving in the twilight of Rome. The traditional tale also ignores the role of climate and disease. The late Roman period saw cooler weather and plagues that hit urban centers hard, thinning populations across Europe. Britain felt these blows, but its rural resilience cushioned the impact. Villages endured where cities faltered, a quiet strength that defies the chaos narrative. So why does the Dark Ages myth persist? It's partly because it's a good story, simple, dramatic, and morally neat, with Rome as the fallen hero and the Britons as lost souls. It's also a product of its time, shaped by Renaissance thinkers who idolized Rome and saw anything less as primitive. But good stories aren't always true ones. The 5th century wasn't a blank slate. It was a canvas, one the Britons painted with their own colors. They didn't just survive Rome's exit, they redefined what Britain could be. Think of SouthCadbury again, its ramparts rising anew. This wasn't a desperate last stand, it was a bold statement, a community staking its claim in a shifting world. Or consider the pottery from York, rougher than Roman wares, but still functional, still beautiful in its own way. These objects whisper of a people who didn't give up. They adapted, innovated, endured. The Dark Ages label assumes a void where there was vitality. It's a term that blinds us to the creativity of a society finding its feet without an empire's shadow. By the 6th century, Britain was no longer a Roman province. It was something new, a patchwork of petty kingdoms and resilient communities. This wasn't decline, it was rebirth. History often loves a clean break, a moment when one era ends and another begins. But the fall of Rome in Britain wasn't a cliff. It was a slope, a gradual slide into something different. The Britons didn't lose their identity. They reshaped it, blending Roman echoes with their ancient roots. This resilience, this ability to adapt, is what carried them forward. So, the next time you hear Dark Ages, question it. The lights didn't go out in Britain. They flickered, shifted, and burned on in a new form. What happened after Rome left wasn't collapse, it was reinvention. And that's a story worth telling, not as a footnote to an empire, but as the dawn of a nation.